the big issue I raised, that is inductions of deserving black players, will likely not get better until there's a consistent representative number of black and non-white people on the screening and voting committees, with folks taking a much broader and even-handed look at players while leaving any biases, stereotypes, and dismissiveness they may have on the shelf. Greetings, good people. Welcome to a book reading of Tell Me Again Why These Mostly Black Players Are Not in the Hall of Fame. Is It Racial? My name is Sheldon Curry. I'm the author of the book, a book I finished in August 2021. And I'm hoping that my excerpts will give you a good feel for what the book is. It's a book that juxtaposes race, bias in the Baseball Hall of Fame process. It's centered around me profiling 13 deserving black players who should have been in the Hall of Fame that played primarily between 1950 and 1980. And I also profiled 15 Negro League players, and there was a dozen or so other topics that I dealt with. And one of the themes in the book was to ensure that people know that I believe that the Baseball Hall of Fame process, though not life and death, is a microcosm of American society, because when they fail to properly honor black folks, it's easier to demonize us and do the things that we've seen, unfortunately, throughout our history here. Before I get into the excerpts, the hard copy book is 1,831 pages. Then the book is available on Amazon.com in their e-reader Kindle library, so you can purchase it there for $29.99. You can also look at a sample. I will let you know at the end of the program about how to purchase limited copies of the hardcover book. This book is a lot about not only race and process and stats and comparative analysis, but it's so much more. And of course, I would be here all day if I tried to do excerpts from the entire book. But I'm hopefully to give you a good cross section of what the book is about and kind of titillate you a little bit to want to hear more. And here we go. So this excerpt is from pages 299 to 301, contained in chapter 27, and the title of that chapter is Need a Lot More Diversity on the Veteran Screening and Voting Committees. Let's summarize the demographic composition of the screening committees and the voting committees for the 10 elections from December 2010 through December 2019. Now remember, the period from 2010 through 2015 represents the first 6 elections held under the then every 3-year era elections, followed by the next 4 elections from 2016 to 2019 under the revised system where 4 separate eras were created and first implemented in 2016. Now, I'll cut away from the excerpt. Obviously, that first couple of sentences is also speaking to something I'd already spoken about. So folks may not quite understand yet, but they'll get caught up once I get through the excerpt. As you have observed from the composition of the committee overviews, the last 4 elections did not include the Golden Days era or the early baseball era. Now back to the excerpt. First, and maybe most important, let's review the composition of the screening committees. Each year there have been 11 people given the task of identifying the 10 players and contributors placed on that year's ballot. Over the 10 elections, the screening committees have been overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly men, therefore overwhelmingly white men. Though most members have served several years, clearly by design, there have been a total of 110 screening committee slots over the 10 election years, and diversity is barely seen. In fact, turn that barely into rarely, since only 4 of the 110 slots, which represents just 3.6%, were occupied by a black person, and 4 of the 110 occupied by a woman, which is also 3.6%. As bad as this is, it's worse, since one person, Claire Smith, a woman and an African American, is the only black person and woman to serve during the 10-year period. Hence, the total non-white, non-male representation of the 10 election years for the people empowered to screen eligible players and contributors for Cooperstown consideration is a woeful 3.6%. I acknowledge the lack of diversity does not automatically imply bias, and I'm sure many, if not all, the members perceive themselves as being fair and objective, and some likely have been. Nevertheless, given past and recent history relative to bias, discrimination, and lack of consideration for a number of potential impacts, this needs to be drastically improved. Even if the diversity numbers are a little better due to an oversight on my part, an error in the source material, or the members of the committee identifying themselves racially or ethnically different than commonly known, it is still not a pretty picture. Now let's look at the composition of the voting committees. Each year there have been 16 people given the task of deciding who gains interest into Cooperstown among the 10 players and non-players placed on a ballot each year. Though a small few have served multiple years, there have been a total of 160 voting committee slots over the 10 election years. White people had a total of 128 voting slots, which represented 80% of the slots. Black people, that's African American, Canadian, Latin American blacks, comprised 19.4% of the 160 voting slots, with Claire Smith again being the only woman. She had the opportunity to vote in 3 elections, 3 of the 10, therefore giving women a paltry 1.9% of the vote of the 10 election years. Lastly, the only other person of color on the committee was Al Avila, who voted in the December 2018 election. His one-time participation equates to an awful 0.6% for non-black Hispanics on the voting committees. Although the voting committees overall have been more diverse than the screening committees over the 10 elections, the representation is still far from equitable, especially given the diversity of the game today with players in the big leagues from all over the world. A summary of both committees reveals that only 3.6% of the screening committees and 20% of the voting committees were non-white, while only 3.6% of the screening committees and 1.9% of the voting committees were not male. And then I conclude the excerpt with, why is this problematic? First is the obvious, a very poor optic. Secondly, the lack of diversity in any arena usually lends to a dearth of consideration for other viewpoints, possibilities, and solutions, which often means that the product, service, or policy delivered is typically nowhere close to optimum. For Cooperstown, it likely means that certain players, their strengths, playing styles, impacts, and contributions may not be properly considered because of a continual, likely more homogeneous thought process. An example would be how many of those who screened folks onto a ballot considered the hardships black players had to endure, particularly the period covered by the then Golden Era Committee and how they overcame obstacles to have very good careers. Effectively, there likely is a lack of sensitivity for circumstances like these. And we have already seen clear evidence of a lack of sensitivity and forethought when the powers that be, which likely included some people on the screening committees, created the equal opportunity for the ill-conceived pre-integration era that I have railed about as blatantly unfair. It seems there has been an attempt by the Veterans Committee structure to be somewhat more inclusive, particularly for those who vote. But the composition of the voters over the 10-year span is still not good. Hence, the big issue I raised, that is, inductions of deserving black players, will likely not get better until there's a consistent representative number of black and non-white people on the screening and voting committees, with folks taking a much broader and even-handed look at players while leaving any biases, stereotypes, and dismissiveness they may have on the shelf. With the 2010 establishment of the 3 eras, the poorly thought out and unfair equal opportunity provided the pre-integration era, and the composition of the screening committees, the results typically have not been good for deserving black ball players. Even with the changes to the process in 2016 with the establishment of 4 distinct eras, the outlook does not look promising, particularly for those black players who last played 30, 40 or more years ago.